Hey there, Fiber Junkies! Welcome back to the Color Cauldron. I'm Johanna, the owner and dyer behind Potion Yarns and host of this podcast. And today I have something very new and very exciting for everyone. If you are a returning viewer and you have seen the podcast in the past, this is a completely new segment, a completely new thing that we're doing today. And if this is your first time, you picked a good one because this is going to be really, really fun. Today we are starting the very first in what I hope will be a good long series of Saturday Night at the Movies. I'm so excited for this. I had this idea actually last year before I'd even started my podcast the very first time. And when I was first getting it started, I decided it was a little too ambitious of a project to start with. So I wanted to just get my feet wet, kind of get started and figure out what I was doing with the podcast and get going before I jumped in whole hog and went for this crazy fun but complicated idea. And today I'm finally getting around to starting it. So the idea is this. I am hoping to do this once a month. It may be a little bit closer to like 6 to 8 weeks or so, but at least every so often I'm going to bring you a special Saturday Night at the Movies segment. So how this works is every single time that we do Saturday Night at the Movies, I'm going to bring you a different film that we're going to review and talk about, and then you can go and watch the film. Unfortunately, we can't show it on here, but I'll tell you what I'm watching and you can go watch it as well. Each of the films is going to have a scene that has to do with knitting, crochet, some kind of fiber crafting, wool, possibly some sheep, some sort of something that involves wool or knitting with wool or working with fiber arts as a craft. Most of these are going to be films where that doesn't center around the plot. The plot is going to be something completely different. There just might be a random scene of somebody knitting or somebody spinning yarn in the background or someone talking about raising their sheep and carding wool or something like that. But they're all going to have some kind of relation to that. There might be a film occasionally, every now and then, where I include something that doesn't have a scene with knitting necessarily, but this year, if you don't already know, my shop is doing yarn clubs where you get every month we have a different exclusive colorway that is dyed just for that month, and this year's theme is Stars of the Silver Screen. So this month for January, we did Rosalind Russell. And today we have a Rosalind Russell film. Now this one does have a knitting scene in it, but if I have a really great film that just coordinates with one of our stars that we're doing the yarn clubs for or something like that, I may include it as well, even if there's not a direct reference or a direct scene with knitting. But I'll try to keep it to things that include knitting, wool, spinning, crochet, etc. Some kind of crafting with wool. I think this is going to be really fun. There are actually a lot of movies out there that have little scenes. If you have some favorites, make sure that you leave a comment below or send me a message and let me know what films you think I should include that have some kind of knitting or wool related scenes in them. But I've got quite a list started already. I've already got my next like 4 movies picked out, so I'm really, really excited. We're going to have so much fun with these. Okay, so today let's talk about the film that we're doing. Now, each time that we do this, we are going to include like a synopsis of the film, like a quick little movie review. I'll give you my thoughts and opinions on it. I'll keep it very brief though. And then we're also going to include a pattern every single month that is coordinated to go with it. Now, these are not my patterns, so I will give you links below where you can find the pattern. I will try to include some free ones, but a lot of them are going to be for purchase patterns. Some of them will only be available in books. I'm going to do my best to make sure that they're all available on Ravelry, but some of them may only be available in books. And if so, I will give you links to where you can see those books or try to purchase them online, etc. So, today's film, as I mentioned, has Rosalind Russell in it. She was our star for January Yarn Clubs, and if you don't know anything about her, she's one of my favorite old stars. She's sassy, she's smart, she's fast-talking, witty, clever. She often played an ultra-modern career woman in the 1930s and 40s and into the 50s and beyond, but she frequently played these very competent, confident career women, but then they would get completely bowled over by some crazy circumstance or by falling in love or by getting caught up in some crazy conundrum or something that they had to solve. And I just love her verve and her sassiness and her vivacious nature. She's very, very interesting to watch, and she had an amazingly hilarious comedic sense of humor. She's really, really good in comedies, but she was also quite poignant in dramas, so I highly recommend you check her out. One of my favorite films, Auntie Mame, is from later in her career in the 1950s, and she's absolutely stunning in that. But today we're going to go back to her early career and look at another favorite film of mine, The Women. The Women was a film from 1939. If you don't know very much about old vintage Hollywood in the 1930s, let me just share with you, 1939 was the year for films. It was like the golden year or something. I don't know what was going on. I don't know what everybody was eating, drinking, smoking, whatever in Hollywood, but oh, hi Phoebe. They were awesome at it. Because that was the year that brought us such amazing classics like Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, The Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn. Amazing, amazing films. Tons more. The list goes on and on and on. I feel very sorry for the judges at the Academy Awards that year. How they ever chose winners for all of those categories with so many great films is beyond me. Now, The Women did not win any Academy Awards, which is a bit of a bummer because it is fantastic. But like I said, they were up against some very stiff competition. However, even though it never won any awards in its time, it was hailed that year as one of the greatest films of the year. And it did receive rave reviews from the critics and the audiences. It made a ton of money, and since then it has actually been one of the films from 1939 that has aged the best because it has constantly been a favorite at film revivals, film festivals, DVD sales, and you can find it online in several different places. I purchased my copy on Amazon.com, and I believe you can still get it. I'll look that up, and if you can, I'll put a link to it below so that you can get a chance to watch this. You can also usually find it at your local public library. It's a very popular film. It's not hard to find. It's not very obscure. It's not out of print or anything, so most libraries will have a copy of it or can get you one if you haven't seen it. So, the synopsis of this amazing film is really, really unique because this film is completely all women, all female cast. There are no men on the screen at all. You don't hear any men's voices over the telephone. There's a couple scenes where women are talking to men on the phone, but you don't hear any of their voices. And fun fact that I learned, when researching this film, I learned that there are actually no men in any of the photos, paintings, even the animals. There are several little pets in the film of the main characters, like dogs and horses and things. All of the pets are even females. So when they call them by name, they're girl names and things like that. So there's no males in this entire film, which is kind of unusual and stunning in its own right, even though men are central to the plot, and the plot revolves around all of these women and their relationships with men. So what's going on in this story? Basically, this film is about a whole group of high society bored housewives. Most of them are married. There's a couple that aren't, but the huge majority of them are married, some of them multiple times. They're all bored housewives that have way too much money. Their husbands work. This is back in the 30s, so this was during a time when, while some women did go to work, the majority of married women, after they got married, they quit their jobs and stayed home and raised children, or if they didn't have any, just took care of the house, had hobbies, patrons of the arts, etc. So a lot of times especially these wealthy women that didn't have anything that they didn't have to go to work, so they were often quite bored, and they spent a lot of time getting their nails done and getting their hair done and shopping and fiddling with their decor and all of these things. So we get a little glimpse into the lives of these high society bored women that have way too much time on their hands and have nothing better to do except gossip and backstab and meddle in each other's lives. The main character, Mary Haynes, played by Norma Shearer, is this beautiful, vivacious, really quite happy housewife. She's actually very much in love with her husband. She has a daughter that she loves very much, and she's a really great hands-on mom, very involved in her daughter's life. She has a lovely home. She's very stylish. She's just the epitome of what every woman wants to be. She has all of these friends who are married and involved in her life as well, and they're in varying stages. Not all of them are as happy as her, but they all spend a lot of time together. And early on in the film, we find out that a lot of them are very, very gossipy, and they love to share stories and be in each other's lives. And so there comes this scene where one of her friends is at the manicurist and overhears this story about Mary Haynes' husband and that he's stepping out on her, which is code for having an affair. So, of course, she ends up gossiping and ends up in a very catty manner sending Mary Haynes to the same manicurist. And so Mary hears about her husband's infidelity from a manicurist who doesn't know that that's who she is. And so then the film centers around her trying to decide what she's going to do about this infidelity. And then she ends up deciding that she's going to need to go away and think about it for a while. She separates from him and decides to get a divorce. A bunch of her friends are getting divorced, and so they all go to Reno to get their divorces, and with varying results. I'm not going to spoil it for you or tell you what happens from there, but that's kind of a little overview. The gal that her husband is having an affair with is played by Joan Crawford, who was another huge star of the 30s and 40s. Joan Crawford is the bad woman, the other woman, the kind of slutty, low-class sales girl who catches the millionaire's eye and gets him to cheat on his wife, but she doesn't really care about him. She's just after his money and, likes the attention and wants to get rich quick. So she's kind of the bad egg in here. Rosalind Russell plays the friend of Mary Haynes, who sends her to the manicurist. She is the most gossipy, bitchy, backstabbing, ridiculous, caricatured, over-the-top, silly woman ever. And Rosalind Russell plays her to perfection. I mean, everything about this woman is crazy and silly. Even her hats are ridiculous. Her clothes are silly and frou-frou and just not in good taste. She has plenty of money to afford the taste, but she doesn't have the taste to actually know what's good taste and what isn't. So she just looks silly. She's very loud. She's very, just gossipy and in everybody's business and meddly, and her facial features and expressions in that film are just hilarious. So she's quite a treat to watch. I highly enjoy her performance in there, and she's really hilarious. Her comedic timing is on point. Her bitchy little comments are really, really great. So when this film came out in the 1930s, if you are not already familiar, there was a thing in state called the production code. So prior to 1933, films were pretty new, and as they were getting made, there wasn't a whole lot of regulation yet, and so some of the early 20s and very early 30s films that you can find, you might be surprised to see some nudity and some scenes about wild living and sex and drugs and things like that, because there wasn't a whole lot of regulation happening yet. There was a production code that was instated in 1930. I believe the Catholic Church was involved in getting that passed. However, it didn't really have any power, and it was kind of more like guidelines, and so nobody really paid attention, or they paid attention, but they kind of gave a nod and then still kept quite a few questionable things in there. In 1933, they really cracked down on the production code, and so until the 1960s, from 1933 to the 1960s, there was a really intense time of censorship in Hollywood, and so you couldn't show nudity at all. You couldn't even show super low-cut gowns. There was all these strategic placements to try and hint at sexy skin showing, but not actually show it. And there was a very strict language about cuss language. You couldn't say a cuss word, you couldn't call someone a bitch, you couldn't do all of these things. So there were really clever little jokes and a lot of double entendre and a lot of getting around the rules in clever little ways. I actually prefer old movies for that very reason, because I think that it made the writers have to be a lot more clever in their jokes and their slurs and their satirical digs and bitchy comments to the different characters. They had to get really, really creative, because they couldn't just say cuss words, and they couldn't just call people terrible names, and they couldn't show sex scenes, so they had to get really creative and clever at insinuating or hinting at sex, drugs, alternative lifestyles, etc., without coming out and showing it or saying it in so many words. It's also why they can be really family-friendly movies, because I grew up watching a lot of these and I had no idea. Sometimes I watch old movies now that I grew up watching and loved, and I can't believe that I missed the reference, but in my innocence as a child, I didn't get the reference, and my parents certainly didn't explain it to me, and then later I'm watching it and I'm like, oh my gosh, they're doing cocaine. Oh my gosh, they're sleeping together, and I did not catch that when I was 5, so they can be really family-friendly alternatives as well, which is another great reason I love old movies. Okay, so another fun thing that I love about this movie is the director, George Cukor, was a very famous Hollywood director at the time. He had done a whole bunch of great movies and continued to do great movies after this. He was actually known as the women's director because he was so good at working with his leading ladies, and the actresses that he worked with time and again requested him for their films, loved working with him, preferred him. I don't know what it was exactly, but he just really was able to connect with them. He was a real artist, and he does amazing films, but he was very much known for working with leading ladies, including very difficult to work with leading ladies, and having them just really give some of their best performances, and many of them very much preferred to work with him. In fact, George Cukor was originally slated to be the director for the very famous epic Gone with the Wind. If you've never seen that, it's the one with Rhett Butler and Scarlett O'Hara, the Southern plantation classic during the Civil War. It's amazing. Go watch it. He was originally supposed to be the director. However, just 3 weeks into the production schedule, he was fired, and there are conflicting stories about what actually happened. Some people say that he was fired. Some people say that he was technically fired, but he was like trying to get fired because he didn't actually want to work with the producer, David O. Selznick, and that they had major creative differences that they could not resolve. So after several weeks of not being able to solve them, they parted ways, and Selznick technically fired him, but it was kind of a mutual choice, or even Cukor's choice to walk away. I don't know what the actual story is, but he was fired, and a new director, Victor Fleming, was brought in to finish the film, and he did a great job. The film is amazing. However, George Cukor still is owed a lot of respect for that film because the leading ladies of that film, Olivia de Havilland, who played Melanie, and Scarlett O'Hara was played by Vivian Leigh. So both of those actresses continued to go see George Cukor, and in what was known as moonlighting, where they would go after hours, after filming all day, they would take their scripts over to George Cukor's house or meet him out somewhere, and they would go over the next day's shooting schedule, their lines and emotional processing and their facial features and, you know, all the things that they're supposed to do, and he would give them direction. So he was basically still working on the film even when he was technically fired, because he had these leading ladies that he was friends with and that he worked well together with, and they just really preferred him over Victor Fleming's style, and he really loved working with them, so he did them a favor, and so really he deserves credit for the film as well, or at least for some of it. So that was kind of an interesting little aside, but that movie came out the same year that The Women did, in 1939, and so it's no surprise that George Cukor was the director, because it's an all-woman cast, and he was known for getting the best out of his women. He was also known for working very, very well and really consoling the kind of hard-to-please star, the leading lady stars that were a little bit picky, like Joan Crawford. And actually, I've heard at times Norma Shearer could also be that way. So a funny little story from this film as well, Miss Rosalind Russell decided that she was going to be a little bit hard to get along with at one point for this film. She admitted later on that she did it completely in a scheming sort of a way to get what she wanted, but that it was the only time she ever stooped this low. But traditionally, in old movies, on playbills and in the credits and things, you would have the biggest stars' name listed first, and it would say like Norma Shearer and Clark Gable in, and then the title of the film, and then underneath it would say also starring or with so-and-so. And then, of course, the smaller your role, the farther down you get on the list, including some bit players never even got mentioned. So, and you can kind of see that here on the film. They've got the names of some of the stars at the top, and then there would be, the rest of them would come below. So originally, Rosalind Russell's character was what was known as a supporting character. Even though she has a lot of screen time and a lot of lines, she wasn't one of the top stars. And at the time that this movie was made, Joan Crawford and Norma Shearer were both bigger stars, and they were more popular, they had more films under their belt, and they had more clout at the studio. So they were going to be given the top billing. Rosalind Russell was supposed to appear underneath the title. She felt that she was a good enough actress, and she had done enough films and enough bit parts and like done her time, paid her dues, that she thought she deserved for her performance to be above the title with both of them. And that did not sit well with Norma Shearer, who was the reigning queen at the time. Norma Shearer was also married to one of the studio heads at that time, so she had a lot of clout because she was not only an amazing box office draw, one of their biggest stars at the time, but she was also married to the guy signing everybody's paychecks. So she kind of got to run the show a little bit, and if she threw a temper tantrum, she kind of got what she wanted. So she was definitely going to be above the title. Joan Crawford was definitely going to be above the title. Rosalind Russell decided she wanted to be. Norma Shearer said no. So they had a little bit of a fight, and Rosalind Russell decided that she was going to get sick and stay home. So she waited until all of the majority of her scenes were done. They just had like a few other little things to film and things that didn't involve her. And then once she was sure that they had shot the majority of the film and she was definitely going to be in it and it would be way too expensive to go back and replace her with a new actress and reshoot everything, once she was sure of that, she pulled this sickness and stayed home to delay the production schedule. And everybody knew what she was doing, and they would call and check on her, and she'd be like, well, it's looking like I'm still gonna be sick. And so finally, after several days, Norma Shearer relented and said, okay, fine, she can go above the title with us. She can share star billing. And she did. And she came back to work. And it was a happily ever after. And the film is phenomenal. And honestly, I believe if you go and watch it, I think you'll agree Rosalind Russell really does deserve to be above the title. She is not really, even though she's considered a supporting character, I really think she's one of the stars. She's in it almost as much, if not as much as the other two. Her character is pivotal to the plot. Without her character, there would be no plot. And she owns that role like nobody else. It's amazing. There's a lot of other people in here, like Joan Fontaine plays a cute little role. There's a well-known gossip columnist from the time, Hedda Hopper. She was the It Hollywood gossip writer at that time, and she could make or break your career. She has another bit role playing a gossip writer, not her own name, but basically modeled after her, so that's kind of fun because she was only in a few films from time to time in little bit parts like that. And so she does pretty well. Mary Boland is hilarious in there as an aging woman with multiple husbands. And so yeah, it's just a great cast, a great script. The original script was a play that they did in the 1920s, I believe. And it was a little bit more, I don't know if raunchy is exactly the right word, but it was definitely had more to it than this film version, and they had to pare down the film quite a bit to go in line with the production code that we talked about earlier. So there is a lot of bitchy commentary, but there aren't any cuss words. You won't see any nudity. You won't hear any really bad negative names, and you won't see any sex scenes. You'll just get a lot of double entendre and a lot of innuendo and a lot of fade outs and things like that. There aren't any men on camera, so there aren't any sex scenes, even though all of the women on camera are very much caught up in their relationships with the men. So it's really all about the lives, the loves, the relationships, and the boredom of these housewives. And also there's kind of this underlying theme that gossip and meddling in other people's lives and running off half-cocked when you don't have the full story, or even when you have the full story, sharing the full story around. It's kind of about how like gossip and rumors can ruin a person's life, and they can dramatically affect everyone, even only remotely involved, which I actually think is a really timely message for today. This is something that's true all throughout time, but I feel like it's extra true right now because of the predominance of social media in our culture. There is so much fake news. Whether you believe or not in fake news, I don't think it's any secret that whatever side of the political party you're on, or whether you're in the middle, wherever you fall on that political spectrum, we all know that there are biased news sources out there, and even sources that try not to be biased. Everybody is sharing things that, you know, we call it clickbait. They just want to share a headline that gets your attention and gets you to click on the link, or gets you to buy the newspaper or magazine, or gets you to watch the news story, or whatever it is. They use buzzwords, they use clickbait, they use scare tactics, all of this stuff just to get people's attention. And a lot of times what we've been seeing lately is there's all these stories, news stories getting shared on blogs and social media and in the news where we're not getting the full story. We see a part of something, we see a part of a video, or we hear one person's side of something, and we're not getting the full story. And if we run off half-cocked and just start sharing that everywhere, we could ruin people's reputations and their lives. And I find that's a very, very timely message with our predominance of social media and just how crazy and polarized and divided are, especially here in the United States, but I feel like all over the world that's happening. And so, yeah, not to get too serious on you because it is largely a comedy, but it's a comedy drama. It mixes really serious themes like that with the really hilarious, funny little comments and funny lines and really funny scenes. So yeah, I hope you really enjoy the film, just like I did. As you can tell, my review is pretty glowing. I think this is a stellar film. I give it 5 stars all the way. I definitely think it's a must-watch for everybody. Even if you're not an old movie fan, I think you'll find enough in it that you can appreciate as a modern audience. Like we talked about, some of those recurring themes, as well as some of the really funny innuendo and more subtle jokes. It's really, really fabulous for that. It's really fabulous for the fashion and the hair if you're into vintage at all. It's stunning. The other cool thing about this film is it is a black and white film. There is, however, a 6-minute, I think it's about 6 minutes, 5 to 6 minute Technicolor fashion show. So you get original Technicolor. The Technicolor was still fairly new in the 1930s, the late 30s. It had come around in the early 30s, I believe, or mid 30s, and it was starting to get introduced, but it really wasn't used very widely until into the 1940s, and even then you still had black and white films up until the early 1960s. It was quite expensive, and in the early 1930s only the biggest films could afford to have a Technicolor sequence or even do the whole thing in Technicolor. So 1939 was also the year of, actually I think it might have been 1938 that The Adventures of Robin Hood came out, either 38 or 39, but that movie with Errol Flynn was one of the early completely Technicolor films. The entire thing is in color. Gone with the Wind was in color, which was extremely expensive because it's so long, such an epic. But The Women is in black and white except for this little sequence. But it's really fun because the women go in and they're watching this fashion show, and you sit down in black and white, and then suddenly the curtain opens and these models come out in these gorgeous colored gowns and phenomenal hats and all of that. So now that we've talked a little bit about the synopsis, the plot, what's going on, some of the background behind the film, what is our knitting scene? I really liked picking this film because Rosalind Russell, our star of the month, is the one who does the knitting in this movie. In the fashion show sequence that I just mentioned, which is about halfway or not quite halfway through the film, right before the fashion show starts, we see the women kind of gathering and chatting and gossiping and starting to like spread some rumors, and Rosalind Russell is knitting on what looks like a garter stitch wide scarf. It's some kind of a garter stitch rectangle. She's knitting on long straight needles, and it's just garter stitch, and I find it fascinating because most of the time she's not looking at what she's doing. She's like knitting and talking and like leaning over someone to talk. It's hilarious. She does an amazing job, and she sits down and knits through the fashion show as they're watching it, and when they get up, you know, you can see that she's still knitting along merrily on her way. Since this is in the black and white section, we don't get to see what color she's knitting, and we don't ever get to know what it is because they don't reference it at all. No one makes mention of it. It's one of those little things that if you're not looking closely, you'll miss it because it's just a brief little scene here and there at the beginning and end of the fashion show, but it's definitely in there, and I absolutely love including that. So, also, fun fact, did you guys know, in the 1930s, circular needles were not a thing yet. I am a die-hard circular fan, and even though I love knitting vintage styles and vintage authentic patterns, I do not love only knitting on double-pointed needles or straight needles. I prefer circulars all the way for almost all of my knitting these days. But back in the 1930s, circular needles were not a thing yet. So pretty much everybody knit on long straight needles or double-pointed needles when they were knitting in the round, which most garments were knit flat in pieces and sewn up and seamed. Even a lot of socks and stockings were knit flat and then seamed, and they'd have a seam up the back, kind of like the old vintage stockings that you can still purchase online that have a seam up the back. Those ones are done by a machine and are quite a bit different, but same kind of a concept. However, some people were knitting socks in the round and occasionally a sweater, and so there would be double-pointed needles for knitting in the round. It just wasn't as popular as it is now to knit in the round. Most items were still seamed, largely because most people back then knew how to sew and were used to dressmaking patterns, where you would cut things into pieces, fabric into pieces, and then sew them up. And so they did their knitting patterns much the same way. So yeah, that was kind of a later invention in the 50s and 60s, and so that's why Rosalind Russell is knitting straight on long straight needles. So your pattern for this week, the fun thing, you may have already figured it out because I'm sporting it. This hat is our 1930s pattern for the week. I chose this hat because I noticed that it looked a lot like the really cute little styled hats that you see in the women. There are all kinds of hats in this film. You'll have like big, crazy, amazing, intricate ones with veils that are really, really pretty. You'll have big, wide picture hats in the fashion show sequence. They've got these really big hats. Sometimes they were called a cartwheel hat because it would look like the big wheel that was on an old-fashioned cart because it was that wide and huge. And then you'll find cute little like tight, close hats that are really close around their face. So that's what I chose to knit. I got really excited because I found this fabulous pattern, which is an authentic 1930s pattern from Great Britain. And I found it in one of my very favorite books, A Stitch in Time, Volume 2, which I got for Christmas this year. This is a collection of vintage patterns, authentic vintage patterns, that the authors found and they updated for modern knitters. So they are still true to the old styles. You'll find the old vintage proportions, vintage ease, vintage look on all of them. They're very authentic. So these aren't updated for modern audiences, for people that want modern clothes that just have a timeless appeal. Although some of them do have that. There's a few cabled sweaters in here that look like they could have come off of the rack at, Old Navy or the Gap today. But most of them have a very vintage look and feel, like this one on the cover. And they print the old original vintage pattern in there, and then they also print their updated version, which will include extra sizes, any adjustments they've made. Sometimes the old patterns were not always test knit or checked for errors very closely, and so the authors made sure that they were careful to catch any errors, to do test knitting, to update, etc. So you can have a really, really great look at the original pattern as well as an updated version. So this is the hat that I knit, and the title is called "A fez est so piquant." I love that. So they're calling this a fez. Now I did make a few adjustments. I am going to check on Ravelry to see if this is available, and if it is, I'll leave the link below. Otherwise, I will leave a link to where you can find this book, because you can purchase it online, although it is hard to find. But I believe you can still get it on Amazon, and you can definitely find it on eBay places and things like that. But the idea is it's just a close-fitting little hat that you can wear on your head. And it's supposed to just frame your face. Now you can wear it in their modern updated version. The model is wearing it a little bit further back on her head. In the original pattern version that you can see here, they're wearing it down over her brow, so it comes down over the forehead. It's kind of up to you on how you would like to wear it. But I made a couple adjustments to mine. When I was knitting this, I was using the modern updated version originally, and they extended the length of their hat when they were knitting the crown, and as I was knitting it, I was very worried it was going to be way too big and way too long because I have kind of a small head. So I actually consulted the original vintage pattern that they have in small print here in the book, and I found that it was considerably shorter in the crown than their modern updated version, and so I knit it the original vintage way. Other than that, that's really the only change they made to it, plus maybe I think there might have been a slight change on the gauge, but other than that, it's pretty much exactly like their old vintage pattern. So I just kept mine to the original vintage length, which is about half as tall as they did it in here. I don't know why they knit theirs so long, because to me that would have just been crazy. And I got gauge on my gauge swatch, by the way, so I don't know how they got theirs so long. But anyways, what I love about this hat is it's really, really easy. The only things you have to know how to do are garter stitch, knit every row, flat, and then stockinette stitch, knit on one side, purl on the other side, and you are knitting the hat flat and then seaming up the back, and then you have to just know how to decrease, like knit two together. That's pretty much it, and then sewing up a seam. You could probably pick up the crown and do it where you don't have to knit the seam as much, but I went ahead and just did it the old original way. It's super easy and quick, and it doesn't look that bad. You can probably see the seam on the back of my hat here, somewhere back there, but it's really not too bad. It's not very noticeable, and I just keep mine at the back. The other thing I love about this is it's a knit in a DK weight, so it goes super quick and easy. It doesn't even take a full skein. Just one skein of yarn will be fine. In their pattern, they had a pretty generous yardage. I think it's like 270 yards or something like that of DK. I think that my skein I purchased was around $250, I believe, and I think I only used about half of it. So it went pretty quickly. If you're making yours longer or a little bit wider, you will probably need the full 270 yards or pretty close to that. But I think mine might have only been 230 yards. It wasn't very much. So I chose to use a solid hand-dyed skein of DK yarn that I found at my local yarn store, Yarn Social, here in Kansas City. Here's what I have left of the skein. This was a nice full cake, so it's about half or just under half of the skein left. So I probably have enough for either a really small hat or put it with another color and make, you know, some fingerless gloves or a hat or something. I really, really loved the color, and I chose mine because I wanted to go with something that was authentically 1930s, and the colors of the 1930s tended to be a lot of like pastels and kind of more muted shades. This kind of like, it's almost like a muted robin's egg color. I don't know if you can see that too well, but it's like a blue. It's really, really soft. It's not really got any green to it. It's really a pretty straight blue, but it's almost like a dusky grayish blue. But it's just very, very soft and pretty, and I really love it. I apologize because I do not remember the name. I can't seem to find my ball band anywhere of this yarn. So I know that I got it at Yarn Social, so I will pop back in there before I release this video and look around and see if I can find it. And then I'll put the yarn company and the colorway name in the description box below. But you can use any skein of DK weight. This is a superwash merino, and this hat would be great in just about any kind of wool yarn that has some good bounce to it. I would avoid making it with anything really drapey, like a silk blend or bamboo. I think it would be best in 100% wool or a superwash wool. A wool and nylon would be fine. An acrylic would even be fine if you are on a really tight budget and you need to stick to something super, super easy. The other thing I love about this hat, and I didn't discover this until after I knit it, I'm wearing it a lot more like they showed it in both the vintage pattern and the modern updated version, where it's kind of you've just got this little crown and then there's this deep brim. And when I first took it off the needles though and I was trying it on, I discovered that it actually can be worn multiple ways. So this way, in order to wear it this way, I actually fold it over at the brim. So if I unfold it, it's like this long. And down here where you pick up the stitches, because you knit this part flat and then you pick up stitches here. And when you pick up the stitches, that is where they lengthened the hat originally, that I ended up cutting some of those rows out and doing mine longer. But if you don't fold it in, so if you want to wear it like the hat in the book or like I've been wearing it, you just take that and you kind of tuck it up, so it creates this little like seam line there, and it gives it this really deep welted kind of look. That was a very authentic vintage look at that time. If you want to wear it more like a beret style, you can totally do that. Just pull it out longwise, put it on your head, and then you're gonna kind of like blouse it over. I don't have a mirror, so I hope that this is right, but this is what I was doing earlier. I was playing around with ways to wear it earlier, and you kind of like blouse it over and you can kind of like shift it however you want on your head. But it gives you options, and that way you can wear it multiple ways, which I think is really, really cute. I love finding different ways that I can wear my hand knits and make them more versatile, and I absolutely love hats. I collect old vintage hats, and I love knitting hats. They're one of my very favorite projects because they take so little yarn, they're so quick and easy, and they're so cute and flattering and attractive, and they cover up a bad hair day, which I'm having today actually. I was gonna have my hair way cuter than this, but I'm having a bad hair day and it did not work. And schedule says I gotta film today, so I'm just winging it and going with it. And thank God I made a hat and not a sweater like I'd originally planned to do, because this is way better. So that's our pattern for today. I'll leave a link below where you can find that. Hopefully you can get your hands on this amazing book, because there's a bunch of other great patterns in there. If you want to go for something else from this era, if you're inspired by the 1930s and you want to try some other patterns, I highly recommend you check out A Stitch in Time. There's volume 1 and volume 2, and both of those have 1930s patterns in them, by Susan Crawford and Jane Waller. And I also recommend that you search on Ravelry for vintage patterns, but be careful what you find. A lot of the vintage patterns on Ravelry are like vintage inspired, and they tend to be more modern, and they don't necessarily look super vintage, which might be what you want, in which case that's great. But if you're looking for a really authentic pattern, you're going to want to look for someone who specifically designs to be an authentic period piece or a reproduction piece. There are a bunch of people who do those, but you have to go search for them. If you look back through some of my old videos though, especially the question and answer that I did back in the fall, I talk about some of my favorite vintage designers that you can find on Ravelry. They're modern women that are writing these amazing patterns in the vintage style, but for modern knitters. A lot of them are knit in the round, have minimal seaming, or have updated fibers, and lots of fun indie dyed yarns and things like that. So I highly recommend you check those out. But here's a few little tips of things to look for 1930s fashions if that's what you are wanting to create. So in 1929, the stock market crashed, and that brought about the Great Depression. We've all heard that. We all learned that in school, right? So everybody was broke, had no money, etc., etc. With that, interestingly enough, the hemlines that had been quite short during the flapper period, while people were dancing Charleston and getting really, really scandalous and rouging their knees and all that, dropped dramatically down to the floor. And in the early 1930s, they were almost to the floor, or at least about calf length. As the decade progressed towards the end of the 1930s, where we're coming into the film The Women in 1939, skirts were raising a little bit, and they still weren't going to be super short, and they usually wouldn't go up to the knee. They'd still go below the knee, usually by a couple of inches down to the ankle, somewhere in there. Most women wore skirts and dresses most of the time. However, by the late 1930s, trousers for women had started to become socially acceptable and widely seen on stars and fashionistas and wealthy women of the period. And they were usually high-waisted trousers with long, wide legs that went all the way to the floor. And they were usually paired with a cute button-up or a little hand-knit sweater, a Fair Isle top, something like that. And they tended to be more like dress slacks. They didn't really wear jeans or anything like that at that time, but they had like dress slacks and these nice high-waisted pants that were really quite attractive. They tended to be worn for more casual wear and things at home. They still weren't worn out for evening wear or anything like that for the women, but they were becoming socially acceptable, and a lot of women like Marlene Dietrich and Katharine Hepburn were wearing full-on menswear with tuxedo jackets and ties even, and flat shoes as opposed to heels, and starting to make it much more socially acceptable for women to be seen wearing trousers around the clock and even out in public. So if you're looking for knitwear patterns, you tend to want to look for things that have a really high waist. The waistline in the 1930s and 40s was at your natural waistline, which is really right around the top of your belly button. So a lot of times people today refer to their waist, they're talking more about their hips, which is further down where a lot of people wear their pants. Your waistline is actually at the top of your belly button, right here in the middle. It should be that part, if you're a girl, where your waist comes in a little bit. Even if you're like super, super skinny and you don't have a lot of curves, you will have a little bit of an indent there, usually under your rib cage, right where the rib cage stops. That's where your waist is. They really like to accentuate the waist in the 1930s, and this can be really helpful, especially if you are one of those girls who doesn't have a lot of curves and you want to enhance what you do have. I am one of those that I don't have a ton, so I like to enhance what I do have by wearing fitted things at my waist, belts right at the natural waistline, high-waisted pants and skirts with short little cropped sweaters that I knit with that stop right around my natural waistline or just below, because I like to kind of draw in and give the illusion of that hourglass figure even when I don't have one. So that's something that you want to look for in patterns as well. Also, back detailing was really, really popular in the 1930s. So really dramatic low cuts where it's real high in the front and then like a really deep cut in the back showing bare skin, or having like lace or embroidery, or a lot of little hand knit sweaters at the time would have a little slit for you to get your head in, and then there would be little buttons right on the back of your neck so that it would close around your neck, so it was like high-waisted and close here, but then you could unbutton them and open it up so you could still get it off of your head. But it made really pretty little back button detailing, so you can put some really cute little buttons like pearl details or mother of pearl. There's little wooden buttons, cute plastic ones. You can find some fun vintage buttons and make some really cute little sweaters that way. So those are some things to look for 1930s fashion. And the other thing you want to look for is some really great lip color and some fabulous red. Another cute little thing about the women that I forgot to mention earlier, there are a couple scenes in there that center around a beauty parlor and a manicurist, and all of these rich women going and spending all their time at the gym and getting manicures and their hair done and facials and all of that. And the color that is the hot new sensation at their manicurist place that year is jungle red. And so there is several scenes where jungle red features prominently in the dialogue and the plot even. And so I painted my nails what I consider jungle red. My very favorite shade that I like to think jungle red looks at, since we don't have it in color, we don't know what jungle red actually looked like, but what I envision it looking like is this color that I'm wearing, which is OPI nail color, and it's called the Thrill of Brazil. It's my favorite old school vintage red. It's just a really great, basic, pure red. Not too blue, not too orange, it's just perfect right in the middle, and it's my favorite. So I covered over my dye-stained hands with some jungle red, which is actually Thrill of Brazil, and I love it. It's great. So I highly recommend that as well. I hope you guys have enjoyed this fun little conglomeration of fashion, knitting patterns, and movie recommendations. I apologize that it's a little rough this time. I'm still getting a feel for exactly how I want to do these going forward, but I hope that that gave you a new film that you can go check out, or if you've seen it before, I hope it's a fun little revisit for you, and maybe you can go watch it tonight and cuddle up with some knitting. I know a great hat pattern you guys can knit. I actually knit this while I was rewatching The Women in preparation for this podcast. It was a lot of fun, and I very much enjoyed it. So I hope you guys have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your weekend. Enjoy your movie night. Leave me a comment below and let me know, have you seen the film? Do you like it? If you go and watch it, come back and let me know how you liked it. And then let me know what films you want to see me do reviews of and feature on this, if they have knitting or wool or sheep or something involved. We are going to do modern films if they have knitting and things in them too, but I'm probably going to focus mostly on old movies because that's kind of my favorite genre. It's what I feel a little bit more comfortable in, and I've had a lot of questions lately about vintage knits and vintage style, so I want to be doing some fun vintage videos for you going forward. And so I just love all of the old knitwear that you find in vintage movies. A lot of vintage films have great hand knits in them as well, so we'll be looking at some of those. So I hope you guys have a great rest of your weekend. It is now time to cast off. Love you.